As always, when studying this period, as any period, it's important to understand the nuance of the period, that it's a little bit of this, it's a little bit of that, it's a little bit of both. So let's look at some kind of basic facts, and then we can look at the ebb and flow of some of this stuff. Um, so the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement, a lot of folks say began after World War II. As Black veterans are returning from service, they have moved up the ranks. They have served as officers. They have gone on leave in places like Paris or London that have very different, not perfect race relations, but very different from those of the United States. And they want more freedom. They want to be able to sit down anywhere they want and order a meal or what have you. So that's the 1940s. The Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 is a huge milestone because it says that the Supreme Court and it's a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court of the United States supports civil rights, right? So it gives civil rights leaders the power to say, look, we are supported at the highest level in this country. So just because local officials want to resist us, we know that we are right. We know that the Supreme Court says we are right and that we will win. Now, this is 1954, so that's a long time before the period that this chapter is based on. The Emmett Till murder in 1955, a 14-year-old boy goes down to Mississippi to visit relatives for the summer. He's originally from Chicago. He is accused of whistling at a white woman, and the white woman's husband and brother-in-law go to his house in the middle of the night, take him out, beat him to death very violently. And the all-white jury finds them innocent, and it is seen as another major turning point in the civil rights movement because it exposes really on a national level the corrupt nature of Southern courts and the grotesque violence of Southern racism. So on the one hand, you have the Brown decision, big deal because it gives legal power to the movement. On the other hand, the murder of Emmett Till and then the subsequent trial of the murderers gives a national spotlight on the struggle. Civil Rights Act 1964 and Voting Rights Act 1965. So you have here, right, this double V for victory in 45 is important, but really it's this 10-year period from 54-55 to 64-65 that will define the civil rights movement. What's good about this? What's good for civil rights? The Warren Court of Earl Warren, nominated by Eisenhower, he is, as the book suggests, probably one of the most important Chief Justices, certainly up there with John Marshall. John Marshall in the early Republic for establishing so many precedents, and then the Warren Court for showing that an activist court can push push legislation forward, support legislation, find it constitutional, and advance the cause of justice. The Supreme Court, for much of its existence, the Supreme Court acts as a kind of sea anchor, slowing down movements for social reform, for economic reform, what have you. The Warren Court is very different in that regard. Actually, as a side note, it's interesting because Earl Warren, he was a former governor of California. Nothing suggested, I mean, he's appointed by Eisenhower. Nothing suggested that he would have been as liberal, right, in the kind of contemporary usage of that word, and such a supporter for civil rights. So much so that later that Eisenhower actually was a little disappointed that he kind of tacked so far to the left upon getting the Supreme Court position. What else is good? The nonviolent Black activism, right? It shows white Americans or non-Black Americans, right, what this movement is all about. And then what's also good for civil rights is that we are still in this idea of New Deal liberalism the government can intervene to create a better society, and that's good, that you want the government to jump in and make things better for people who are either the worst off or have a difficult time. So this goes back to the New Deal, obviously. Things that are bad for civil rights. Yes, the Democratic Party is successful under LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in passing civil rights legislation, that is the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but it splits the Democratic Party in a major way. Remember, a lot of the Democratic support was white Southerners, always had been. Johnson's support of civil rights changes that very much so. Funding for the Vietnam War, that is to say, very tragically, Johnson really wants to support civil rights and fund programs that will help education, help poor people out of poverty, but increasingly he starts moving funds from programs of social uplift to the war, a kind of tragedy of the Johnson administration. 1964 election. Lyndon Baines Johnson versus Barry Goldwater. Goldwater is from Arizona. The South likes him. Arizona likes him. And this is very important because this shows us how politics change in this time period. Goldwater is an anti-New Deal Republican. So again, not Eisenhower. This is not the Eisenhower Republicanism. This is a very different kind of more aggressively anti-New Deal Republicanism. Very small government. I mean, libertarian. It's what we would call libertarianism, right? Small federal government, does not support civil rights legislation. In Goldwater's argument is that it's big government, that the Constitution doesn't allow it. So he makes a very federalist argument in saying that he is against civil rights. Goldwater is one of the most important figures in the creation of modern day conservatism. Again, the big three being Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan. So Goldwater gives republicanism that small government federalist kind of flavor. So meanwhile, LBJ is a New Deal, Great Society Democrat, and this is the apex of that movement, and it is also the beginning of the end of that movement. So while the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 65 can be seen as the pinnacle of Rooseveltian or New Deal or kind of modern liberalism, it is also the beginning of the end. The backlash to that movement in the South in particular spells the end of the New Deal coalition for the Democrats. Meanwhile, Goldwater and the Federalists, although they lose, obviously, big time in 64, the Federalist flavor of conservatism begins to create the groundwork for a new conservative movement, right? That is not the Herbert Hoover Republican Party, is definitely not the Eisenhower Republican Party, but in some respects is closer to Hoover than it is to Eisenhower. Really motivates young people, charges up a lot of folks, in particular in the Sun Belt, right? Folks like Ronald Reagan, and Nixon, folks we'll see again later. So Johnson wins big, but it's the end of this era, right? We will see from Barry Goldwater's election election loss in 64 to Reagan's victory in 1980. That is the ascendancy of modern conservatism. But at the same time, we see the Democratic Party in the New Deal, Great Society mold going down, right? Just for a little bit of perspective, 1968 is a time of chaos and violence in the United States, but it is a time of chaos and revolution and violence across the world. There are student uprisings from Eastern Europe to Latin America, young people demanding more progressive education, more funding, bigger programs, a change in the way that things are taught. This is the beginning of ethnic studies, and a diversifying of the canon, both in English and history and other traditionally conservative disciplines. Urban uprisings throughout the United States as well. Civil rights in the North was different than civil rights in the South. The civil rights movement in the South was marching, nonviolent protest, demanding a vote, demanding equality. In cities in the North, Black Americans said, look, we have this stuff already. We can vote. We're supposed to have equality, but our lives are not equal to the lives of white Americans. So the way that they protested was far more violent than in the South. War, right? Tet Offensive, My Lai Massacre, the American public seeing the American soldiers committing acts of really war crimes, but also losing a war in a way that was really jarring to a country that thought, right, World War II was in everyone's mind, World War II was the kind of the gold standard for victory. That didn't happen in Korea, and it's not happening in Vietnam. There's all kinds of weird murders happening, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Bobby Kennedy, the Zodiac Killer. Andy Warhol is shot. The political violence outside the Democratic National Convention. Richard Nixon wins the presidency. Richard Nixon hasn't been seen since 1960, when he was on the stage with Kennedy. He was his political career was seen as over. He comes out of nowhere and wins. Very, very conservative, anti-communist Nixon. And then all kinds of stuff is happening all over the world, right? This is an interesting photo. The USS Pueblo, which is seized by North Korea. If you look closely at the soldiers' hands, they are giving a subtle or not so subtle signal that they are resisting the North Koreans and letting everyone know what they think about their captivity. Okay, civil rights. Martin Luther King is the most famous. Early Martin Luther King, Montgomery bus boycotts, Selma. This is the nonviolent, passive resistance king. This is the king of I Have a Dream, 1964. Late King becomes more radical. He is anti-Vietnam. He's against the Vietnam War. He's also, in a lot of respects, anti-capitalist, not because he's a Marxist, as many accused him of, but because he has an understanding of Christianity that, like Lyndon Johnson's, is rooted in a kind of austere, salt of the earth reading of the Bible with an emphasis on Jesus and the teachings of Christ. That lend themselves to being somewhat anti-capitalist. So he's time and again says it's not about being a Marxist, it's about being a Christian. Doesn't mean people believe him. He is against the evil triplets of militarism, racism, and economic exploitation. Again, very good and very important speech. Time to Break the Silence, which you can watch. And this is the speech in which he calls the United States the largest purveyor of violence in the world. Again, very different king than we remember. Again, we need to learn this stuff because it's important to have the nuance, to have an accurate reading of history, but also to not fall into the 9-word problem of civil rights. And students who study civil rights, of when you study it, the only thing you remember is Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, Rosa Parks. That's 9 words. And you say, well, what about the civil rights movement? And you go, well, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream. Isn't that enough? It's not. This later king is very important to understanding the movement. Okay, lastly, while Johnson is remembered, or at least the way I've been talking about him so far, is an advocate for civil rights for Black Americans and Mexican Americans, right, based on his upbringing and his support for Head Start and different education programs. However, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act is a huge deal that happens in the Johnson administration. It rolls back the immigration quotas, which have been in place since the 1924 Reed-Johnson Act, and opens up a totally new form of immigration. This is not the immigration of pre-1924. It is not, the huddled masses, the poor, the unskilled from Southern and Eastern Europe. Rather, it is skilled workers, people who have engineering degrees, accounting degrees, nurses, doctors, all of those professions. These are people that often speak English already, or at least are studying English. So this opens up a kind of immigration that really makes the United States look the way it looks today. I mean, certainly Southern California. Grandparents, your generation's parents or grandparents, many of whom came over because of this act. So very, very important Immigration Act in 1965. I will leave it there, and I will put up here a second part of this lecture in which I will highlight the very, very important political and rhetorical shift that happens in this time period in response to civil rights. How is civil rights resisted? It starts off as people who are just manifestly racist, but it evolves in a very subtle and interesting way, and really creates the groundwork for the kind of racism that we see today, right? Racism that isn't defined by necessarily hate speech, although increasingly it is, but rather a positive rights discourse. So that will be in the second part of this lecture.